Walter had tended the grounds at Hartwell for 31 years, and in all that time there was one day each autumn when the great house seemed to hold its breath. The staff had a private name for it, spoken only in the kitchen and never above a murmur: the quiet day. Nobody explained it to the new help. You learned it the way you learned which floorboard groaned underfoot, which door wanted easing shut, by living inside the house long enough. On the quiet day, Mr. Calloway took his coffee standing, said almost nothing at breakfast, and by mid-morning had crossed the east lawn alone to the walled garden, where the iron gate stood locked to everyone but him until the light went out of the sky. Walter knew why, because Walter had been there at the start of it. He and Augustine Calloway had served together once, decades before any of this, before the name Calloway meant anything beyond a man's own two hands, before it opened doors and emptied rooms the length of the county. Men who crossed Augustine Calloway in business did not get a second meeting. They got a courteous letter from his solicitors, and that, people said, was the gentle version. There had been a third man with them in those early years, a quiet, easy-laughing fellow named Thomas Reed, who had given his own life so that Augustine might keep his, in a manner nobody left at Hartwell ever asked about and Walter never volunteered. Augustine had built an empire in the years after, shipping, holdings, interests no one at the house inquired into too closely, but he had also done one other thing nobody at Hartwell spoke of either: he had set aside, quietly and permanently, a sum for Thomas's widow and the boy Thomas never lived to raise. He called it, in the single ledger entry he ever wrote himself, simply the Reed account. Then he had handed it over entirely into the keeping of Mr. Pruitt, the estate's steward of nearly 20 years, and never looked at the books again. A man like Augustine Calloway did not need to. Pruitt was correctness itself, a starched collar, a silver pen, a memory for every figure and every birthday in the house. He sent a basket to the vicarage each Christmas in the master's name, never once forgot an anniversary of service among the staff, and had not, in 19 years, made an error anyone had ever caught him in. He was, in his quiet way, beloved. The staff feared the master and trusted Pruitt, which at Hartwell amounted to nearly the same comfort. Walter had seen the other side of that fear plenty of times over the years, the side meant for men who were not staff. A rival shipping agent had come to Hartwell once, full of bluster about a contested harbor lease, and had left 40 minutes later gray-faced and silent, never to be spoken of in the house again. Augustine had not raised his voice once in that whole exchange, as far as Walter ever heard. He had simply let the men understand, in a few flat sentences, the difference between annoying him and ruining himself, and then he had gone back to his correspondence as though nothing at all had happened. That was the kind of fear Augustine Calloway carried into every room he entered, not loud, never a hand laid on anyone, just the settled certainty of a man who had buried worse things than a bad afternoon and come out the other side colder for it. It was into this household, on an ordinary gray Tuesday with no occasion attached to it at all, that the new secretary arrived. Her name was Eleanor Finch, and she came with one trunk, a good plain coat, and instructions to bring order to 40 years of estate ledgers that had been left, by mutual unspoken agreement, exactly where the last secretary had abandoned them. Nobody at Hartwell thought much of her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Abbott, called her the paper girl within the first week, not unkindly, simply because there seemed nothing else worth calling her. She did not flirt with the footman, did not gossip in the linen room, did not seem to want anything beyond the small back office where the old account books waited under a window that did not quite close. Dusty work for a dusty little office, Mrs. Abbott told her once, by way of both welcome and dismissal. One of the younger footmen, carrying coal past her door, liked to ask if she'd found any treasure yet among the old dead numbers, and laughed before she could answer, as though the question and the laugh were the same joke told twice. Eleanor only thanked Mrs. Abbott and went on sorting, and told the footman, the one time she answered at all, that she supposed she'd no treasure when she found it. She was, by every measure the house used to judge a person, easy to overlook. Walter overlooked her himself, the first month, the way a man overlooks a quiet rain. It was the ledgers that changed it, though nobody but Eleanor knew it yet. She had a habit, going through old accounts, of running the same column twice before she trusted it, and a stubbornness about numbers that refused to behave. Working backward through the estate's smaller trusts one wet week in October, she came to the Reed account and found it, taken a single year at a time, almost dull in its tidiness, a loss here, a poor return there, each one explained in Pruitt's careful hand, each one perfectly reasonable on its own page. It was only laid end to end, 9 years running, candle burned low on her own desk on an evening she ought to have gone home, that the tidiness turned strange. It was the same loss, near enough to the pound every time, blamed always on the same vague misfortune, always settled before any underlying paper could be asked for. When Pruitt came by the account room 2 days later, pleasant, unhurried, asking after her progress, she mentioned the Reed figures in passing, expecting nothing. "Such old business," he said, smiling, already turning to go. "Hardly worth troubling the master with. I keep that one close myself." "It was a small thing," said kindly. Eleanor thought about it for 3 days afterward and could not say why it would not leave her alone. She did nothing rash. She copied the 9 years of figures twice over in her own hand, so there could be no question later of what she had found and when, and she said nothing to Pruitt again. She was new at Hartwell. She was, in the strict sense, nobody, and she understood perfectly well what it might cost a nobody to be wrong about him and everyone in the house loved. She understood, too, what it might cost her to be right. The quiet day arrived 3 weeks later, and Eleanor, like everyone else at Hartwell, felt the house change shape around it without being told why. She saw the master cross the lawn alone in the gray morning light, saw the iron gate close behind him, saw the rest of the staff lower their voices and find small errands to keep themselves well clear of the east wing. She asked no one anything. Near evening, when the kitchen maid carried up the master's tray and came back saying he hadn't touched it and didn't want it fussed over, Eleanor quietly took the tray up the second time herself, set it outside the study door without a word, and left him to whatever he was carrying alone. It cost her nothing to do that, and it was, in its own small way, the truest thing she did all day. She did not need to understand a man's grief to leave it undisturbed. But she had 9 years of figures folded in her coat pocket, and she had not stopped thinking, all that quiet, hushed day, about a widow she had never met going without what was owed her, autumn after autumn, while the house tiptoed around something else entirely. By the time full dark came down over the walled garden, Eleanor had made up her mind that whatever this day meant to Hartwell, it could not be allowed to mean one more year of the other thing as well. Walter was banking the last of the garden fires when he saw her cross the east lawn toward the study, a small figure with her arms full of paper, walking the way a person walks toward something they are afraid of and mean to do anyway. He did not call out. He only watched the light under the study door, and waited, the way he had waited 9 times before for that door to open again. She did not raise her voice, and she did not weep, and afterward the few who were close enough to hear anything at all said only that it was the quietest reckoning anyone at Hartwell had ever witnessed. She laid the figures on his desk in their own neat columns and said simply that she had found a discrepancy in the Reed account going back 9 years, and that she had thought he ought to see it before anyone decided anything further about Thomas Reed's widow's allowance. She did not say Pruitt's name until he asked her to. 9 years, Augustine said, very low, looking at the dates rather than at her, and something in his face Walter would hear about for the rest of his life went, in that moment, entirely still. The same 9 I have stood out there alone. He thought, though he did not say it to her, of a young man's laugh he had not heard in 9 years and a debt he had believed, until that evening, he had at least managed to pay in full to the people left behind. Eleanor said only that she was sorry to bring it to him on such a day, and that she had not known, until the housekeeper told her that evening, what the day was. What the house came to know in the days after was plain enough, that for 9 years, almost to the day Thomas Reed had died, the steward entrusted with his widow's keeping had been quietly taking from the account a little more every autumn, and writing the loss into the books as bad luck. Pruitt did not deny it once the family's solicitors laid the figures before him. There was nothing left to deny, in his own hand, year after year. He was let go without scandal and without a single raised voice, his pension forfeit, the solicitor set to recovering what could still be recovered, and a letter sent that spring to a young man named Daniel Reed informing him, to his evident astonishment, that an old family account had at last been put right and would now see him through his last year of training as his father would have wished. Augustine said almost nothing about Pruitt afterward to anyone in the house. He did not need to. The staff understood, the way staff in a great house always understand such things, that something in him had gone cold, and then, slowly, that something else had not. It was 3 nights later that Walter, locking the garden tools away in the last gray light, heard the iron gate open a second time that week, not in the morning, and not alone. He looked up and saw Augustine Calloway walking the east path with Eleanor Finch beside him, neither of them speaking, her hand resting for just a moment on his sleeve before she drew it back, uncertain whether she was permitted. He did not draw away from her. That was the part Walter carried with him afterward more than anything else, not the few quiet words said at Thomas Reed's small stone, which Walter never asked to hear, but the plain fact that for the first time in 9 years, the gate at Hartwell had opened for two. It was no quick thing after that, and nobody at Hartwell expected it to be. Eleanor stayed on, and the Reed account was made whole and then some, and within the year she had been given charge of it outright, with the solicitor's blessing and the master's, which around Hartwell were understood by then to be very nearly the same signature. She and Augustine Calloway were not married that autumn, nor the next, but by the third the staff had long stopped calling her the paper girl, and Mrs. Abbott, without anyone quite deciding it, had begun setting 2 cups instead of 1 outside the study door each quiet day, because by then it was no longer a day anybody at Hartwell kept alone. Walter is an old man now, and Hartwell has had a long while to grow used to its own changed weather. He still tends the walled garden, still keeps the small stone clean, still remembers, some mornings, the easy laugh of the men it was cut for. But most autumns now there are 2 sets of footprints in the frost leading to it instead of 1, and the house no longer holds quite the same breath it used to on that one day each year. People in the village still speak of Augustine Calloway the way they always did, as a man it never paid to cross. They are not wrong about that. But Walter, who knew him before any of it, thinks of him now the way he thinks of the iron gate itself, closed to nearly everyone in the world, and open, for the rest of his life, to the one woman who never once asked to be let in, and was given the key anyway.